The year was 1847, and in the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, Texas, something unthinkable was happening. On the courthouse steps beneath the scorching sun, 5 young women stood in tattered dresses while men shouted numbers like they were bidding on cattle. Hook 1. Could you imagine being sold like livestock? Her sisters had already been sold to pay their father's gambling debts. Only one remained, 16-year-old Sarah May, her green eyes blazing with defiance as the auctioneer's hammer rose for the final time. That's when a lone figure stepped from the crowd, his weathered face etched with loss, and spoke words that would change everything. "I'll take her as my wife, not my property." The morning had started like any other in Cedar Ridge, with the sun creeping over the mesa and casting long shadows across the main street. But by noon, the entire town had gathered around the courthouse, drawn by news that spread faster than wildfire through the dry brush. Old Man McKinnon had finally run out of luck at the poker table, and Sheriff Tom Bradley was fixing to auction off everything the man owned, including his 5 daughters. Sarah May stood at the end of the line, watching in horror as her sisters were led away one by one. Elizabeth, the eldest at 22, had gone to a rancher from the next county over for $50. Mary Catherine, 19 and gentle as a spring rain, was claimed by a merchant who looked at her like she was goods on a shelf. The twins, Hannah and Rebecca, barely 18, were bought together by a man who owned a saloon 2 towns over, his intentions clear as the whiskey on his breath. Now it was just Sarah May, the youngest and most spirited of the McKinnon girls, standing alone on those courthouse steps. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon light, and though her dress was patched and worn, she held her head high like the proud Irish blood that ran through her veins. "Now then, folks," called out auctioneer Pete Hawkins, a thin man with a voice that carried across the square like a church bell. "We come to the last of the McKinnon girls. Sarah May here is 16 years old, healthy as a horse, and can cook, clean, and tend a garden better than most women twice her age." The crowd murmured and shifted. Sarah May's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the town where the prairie grass waved in the wind like it was beckoning her to run. She tried that once before when she was 14. But the desert had nearly claimed her before her father found her half dead beside a dried-up creek. "Do I hear $20 to start?" Hawkins continued, his hammer ready in his hand. "20, shouted Jake Morrison, a bachelor who owned a small spread outside town. He was known for his quick temper and quicker fists. 25, came another voice from the back. Sarah May closed her eyes and tried to imagine she was somewhere else. Maybe back in the little cabin where she'd grown up before her mother died of the fever 3 years ago, before her father lost himself in cards and whiskey, before everything fell apart like a house built on sand. 30, 35. The bidding went back and forth like a tennis ball, each number feeling like a nail in her coffin. Sarah May opened her eyes and scanned the crowd, looking for any friendly face, any sign of mercy. Most of the townspeople avoided her gaze, too ashamed to meet her eyes. The women clutched their shawls tighter and whispered behind their hands. The men studied their boots or focused intently on the proceedings, treating it like any other auction. Hook 2. What would you do if your life hung in the balance of a stranger's bid? That's when she saw him. Standing apart from the crowd, near the hitching post, where a black stallion waited patiently, was a man she'd noticed around town, but never spoken to. He was tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that was going gray at the temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. His clothes were clean but simple, dark trousers, a white shirt, and a black vest that had seen better days. She knew his name was Daniel O'Brien, and that he'd lost his wife and baby son to cholera the previous winter. $40. The voice belonged to Morton Clay, a man who owned several properties in town and was known to have a mean streak whiter than the Rio Grande. 45, Jake Morrison countered, his face red with determination and too much whiskey. Daniel O'Brien stepped forward, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried across the square like thunder before a storm. $100. The crowd fell silent. Even auctioneer Hawkins blinked in surprise, his hammer frozen halfway to the block. "Did you say $100, Mr. O'Brien?" Hawkins asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I did," Daniel replied, his gray eyes fixed on Sarah May's face. "But not for what you think." He walked closer to the courthouse steps, each footfall deliberate and sure. Sarah May found herself holding her breath, not daring to hope, but unable to look away from this stranger who'd just changed the course of her life. "I'm offering $100, Daniel said, his voice growing stronger.
"And my name?" "Sarah Mae McKinnon."
"If you'll have it, I'd be honored if you'd become Sarah Mae O'Brien, as my wife, not my property, as my partner, not my possession." The crowd erupted in murmurs and gasps.
This wasn't how these things were supposed to go.
This wasn't how any of this was supposed to work. Sarah Mae stared at Daniel O'Brien, this man who was offering her something no one else had in years, a choice. She started, then stopped. Her voice came out as barely a whisper.
"I don't even know you, Mr. O'Brien."
Daniel smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes.
"No, Miss McKinnon, you don't."
"But I've watched you in town, seen how you care for your sisters, how you hold your head up even when the whole world seems against you. I've seen your kindness to Mrs. Henderson when she was poorly, and how you always helped old Pete with his groceries without being asked." He paused, removing his hat and running his fingers through his hair.
"I'm not asking you to love me, Sarah Mae.
I'm asking you to let me give you a chance at a life where you're treated with the respect every woman deserves.
We can figure out the rest as we go."
Sarah Mae looked around at the crowd, at the faces of people she'd known her whole life who'd stood by and watched her family be torn apart. Then she looked back at Daniel O'Brien, this widower who was offering her something precious and rare.
"Dignity. Will you?"
She hesitated, then found her courage.
"Will you treat me as an equal, Mr. O'Brien, not as something you own?"
"I give you my word," Daniel said solemnly.
"As God is my witness."
Sarah Mae took a deep breath, tasting dust and possibility on the wind.
"Then, yes, Mr. O'Brien."
"I'll take your name, and I'll do my best to honor it." The crowd was buzzing now, some folks shaking their heads in disapproval, others nodding with grudging respect. Auctioneer Hawkins looked around uncertainly, his hammer still raised.
"Well, I'll be," he muttered.
"This is highly irregular, but if the lady consents and the bid is good," he brought the hammer down with a sharp crack.
"Sold to Mr. Daniel O'Brien."
But Daniel was already climbing the courthouse steps, extending his hand to Sarah Mae, not as a master to property, but as one equal to another. She took it, her small hand engulfed by his calloused one, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years.
Hope.
"Reverend Miller," Daniel called to an elderly man in the crowd.
"Would you be willing to perform a ceremony right here, right now?"
"I don't want there to be any question about Mrs. O'Brien's status in this town."
Reverend Miller, a kind man with a white beard and gentle eyes, stepped forward. "It would be my honor, Daniel, and might I say, this is the finest thing I've witnessed in Cedar Ridge in quite some time."
And so, on the courthouse steps, where Sarah Mae had nearly been sold like livestock, she instead became a bride.
The ceremony was simple and quick, witnessed by half the town and sealed with a handshake rather than a kiss.
But as Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah Mae felt something shift inside her chest.
The first stirring of what might someday become happiness.
Daniel led her to his horse, helping her up behind him with gentle hands. "My place is about 3 miles out," he said over his shoulder as they rode away from the crowd.
"Nothing fancy, but it's clean and sturdy. You'll have your own room until or unless you decide otherwise."
Sarah Mae wrapped her arms around his waist, marveling at how solid and warm he felt, how safe she felt for the first time in months. The wind whipped her hair as they rode across the prairie, and she found herself smiling despite everything that had happened. Daniel's ranch was exactly as he described, simple but well maintained. The house was small but clean with a covered porch and windows that let in plenty of light. There was a garden behind the house, neat rows of vegetables and herbs that spoke of careful tending, and a barn that housed several horses and a milk cow. "It's beautiful," Sarah Mae said as Daniel helped her down from the horse.
And she meant it.
After the chaos and shame of the morning, this peaceful place felt like a sanctuary. Daniel showed her around the house, pointing out the kitchen with its cast-iron stove, the sitting room with its stone fireplace, and the 2 bedrooms at the back of the house. He paused at the door of the smaller bedroom, his hand on the knob. "This was going to be the nursery for my son, but it's yours now, for as long as you want it." Sarah Mae could hear the pain in his voice, carefully controlled, but unmistakable. "What was his name?" she asked softly.
James, Daniel replied. James Patrick O'Brien. He lived for 3 days.
They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who understood loss in different ways.
Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and continued the tour.
That first evening, they sat on the porch as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sarah May had changed into one of the simple dresses Daniel had left behind. With her permission, he'd carefully explained, it fits reasonably well, and after wearing the same patched dress for weeks, the clean cotton felt like luxury against her skin.
Tell me about your wife, Sarah May said, watching the last light fade from the western sky.
Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory.
Her name was Catherine.
We met at a church social in San Antonio, and I knew the moment I saw her that she was the woman I wanted to spend my life with. She had the kindest heart and the most beautiful laugh. He paused, his hands clasped in his lap. We had 5 good years together before the cholera came through. She fought it longer than most, tried so hard to stay for the baby's sake.
I'm sorry, Sarah May said, and meant it.
It must be difficult having me here in her house. Daniel turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious in the gathering darkness.
Catherine would have liked you, Sarah May.
She would have been proud that her home is giving shelter to someone who needs it. She always said this place was meant to be filled with life and laughter. Over the following weeks, they settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Sarah May took over the household tasks, cooking and cleaning and tending the garden, while Daniel worked the ranch and made trips to town for supplies. They were polite with each other, careful and respectful, like two people dancing around something fragile. Sarah May proved to be everything auctioneer Hawkins had claimed, and more. She could indeed cook, producing meals that made Daniel close his eyes with pleasure after months of his own basic fare. She had a way with the animals, coaxing milk from the cow and eggs from the chickens with gentle patience. The garden flourished under her care, and she even managed to nurse a sick foal back to health. But more than her practical skills, it was her spirit that began to bring life back to the ranch. She hummed while she worked, sang softly to the animals, and slowly began to smile more often. Daniel found himself looking forward to coming home each evening, to sitting on the porch and listening to her talk about her day. I saw a roadrunner this morning, she told him one evening, her eyes bright with excitement. He was chasing a lizard through the garden, and when he caught it, he held it up like he was showing it off. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the laundry basket. Daniel smiled, imagining the scene. They're proud little creatures. Catherine used to say they were the jesters of the desert. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife's name without pain shadowing his features, and Sarah May noticed. She was beginning to understand that healing, like trust, came in small increments. One afternoon, about a month after their unusual wedding, Daniel came home to find Sarah May sitting on the porch steps, tears streaming down her face. A letter lay crumpled in her lap. "What's wrong?" he asked, dropping down beside her with concern. Sarah May held up the letter with shaking hands. "It's from Elizabeth, my sister. She managed to get word to me through the preacher in her town." Daniel waited patiently as she wiped her eyes and composed herself enough to speak. "She says Mary Catherine tried to run away from the merchant who bought her. He caught her and," Sarah May's voice broke. "He beat her so badly she can barely walk." "And the twins?" "The saloon owner is making them work in ways that no decent woman should have to." Daniel's jaw tightened with anger. "Where are they?" "All of them. Elizabeth is the only one who's safe. The rancher who bought her is kind. And he's offered to marry her proper." "But the others?" She looked up at him with desperate eyes. "I have to help them, Daniel. They're my sisters." Daniel stood up, his decision already made. "Then we'll help them. All of them." Sarah May stared at him in amazement. "You mean that, even though it might be dangerous? Even though they're not really your family?" Daniel reached down and took her hands, pulling her to her feet. "Sarah May, you're my wife. That makes them my family, too. We'll figure out a way to get them out of those situations and bring them home if they want to come." The next morning, Daniel saddled 2 horses and packed supplies for a journey. Sarah May had never ridden a horse on her own before, but Daniel spent an hour teaching her the basics. His patience infinite as she learned to control the gentle mare he'd chosen for her. "We'll go to Mary Catherine first," he decided, studying the rough map he'd drawn based on Elizabeth's letter. "She's in the most immediate danger." The ride to Millerville took 2 days, and Sarah May marveled at how different the world looked from horseback. She'd rarely been more than a few miles from Cedar Ridge in her entire life, and the vast expanse of Texas stretched before them like an ocean of grass and sky. They talked as they rode, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes, their fears. Sarah May learned that Daniel had come to Texas from Missouri after the death of his parents, seeking a fresh start in wide-open spaces. Daniel discovered that Sarah May had taught herself to read using her mother's Bible and a handful of books, and that she dreamed of someday seeing the ocean. "It's set to stretch to the horizon and beyond," she told him as they made camp the first night. "Bigger than all the prairie put together and blue as the deepest sky." "Maybe we'll see it together someday," Daniel said. And Sarah May felt her heart skip at the casual way he included her in his future plans. They found Mary Catherine in a boarding house above the general store where her owner worked. She was sweeping the front steps when they arrived, moving carefully like every motion caused her pain. When she saw Sarah May, she dropped the broom and nearly fell. "Sarah May, is it really you?" Mary Catherine's voice was barely a whisper, and Sarah May could see the purple bruises on her sister's face and arms. "We've come to take you home," Sarah May said, dismounting quickly and wrapping her sister in a gentle embrace. The merchant, a thin man named Prescott with small mean eyes, emerged from the store when he saw the commotion. "Here now, what's all this?" "That girl belongs to me fair and square. I got papers." Daniel stepped forward and something in his posture made Prescott take a step back. "I'm willing to buy her contract from you. Name your price." "She ain't for sale," Prescott said. But his voice wavered. "I got uses for her." "I can see that," Daniel said coldly, his eyes taking in Mary Catherine's condition. "The question is whether you want to be compensated for releasing her or whether you want to explain to the sheriff why you've been beating a woman half to death." The negotiation was tense but brief. Prescott, faced with Daniel's quiet authority and the growing crowd of curious townspeople, agreed to release Mary Catherine for $30, more than he'd paid for her, but less than he might have demanded under different circumstances. Mary Catherine could barely believe she was free. She kept touching Sarah May's face as if to make sure she wasn't dreaming, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought I'd never see any of you again," she whispered as they helped her onto Daniel's horse. "I thought I was going to die in that place." The rescue of the twins from the saloon in Dusty Creek proved more complicated. The establishment was rough and dangerous, the kind of place decent folks avoided. And the owner, a man called Snake Morrison, was known to be violent and unpredictable. Daniel spent a day observing the saloon, learning the routines and looking for the best opportunity. Hannah and Rebecca were kept upstairs most of the time, only brought down in the evenings when the place was full of cowboys and drifters with money to spend. "We can't just walk in there and demand their release," Daniel told Sarah May and Mary Catherine as they planned from their room at the town's only respectable hotel. "Morrison's got too many men, and he won't hesitate to use violence." "Then how do we get them out?" Sarah May asked, frustrated by their helplessness. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally, he looked up with the ghost of a smile. "We're going to need help from the local law, and we're going to need to be very careful about timing." The plan they hatched was risky, but simple. Daniel had noticed that Morrison left the saloon every Tuesday morning to conduct business at the bank and visit his other properties around town. He always took his 2 best gunmen with him, leaving the saloon protected by only a bartender and a couple of drunks sleeping off the previous night's revelries. Mary Catherine, despite her injuries, insisted on helping. "They're my sisters, too," she said when Sarah May tried to protest. "I'm not sitting safely in a hotel room while they're in danger." On Tuesday morning, while Morrison was at the bank, Mary Catherine created a distraction by fainting dramatically in front of the saloon. While the bartender and several patrons rushed to help her, Sarah May and Daniel slipped in through the back door and up the stairs. They found Hannah and Rebecca locked in a small, dirty room at the end of the hall.
Both girls looked thin and frightened, their eyes hollow with despair. When they saw Sarah May, they fell into her arms, sobbing with relief and disbelief. "Quickly now," Daniel urged, helping the twins to their feet. "We need to be gone before Morrison returns." They made it out of the building and to their horses without incident, but as they were preparing to ride out of town, they heard shouting from the direction of the saloon. Morrison had returned early. "Ride!" Daniel shouted, and they spurred their horses into a gallop, racing out of Dusty Creek with the sound of pursuit growing behind them. The chase lasted for several miles across open prairie, with Morrison and his men gaining steadily on their group. Daniel's horse was strong and fast, but the others were carrying double loads, and Mary Catherine was still weak from her ordeal. Just when it seemed they might be caught, salvation appeared in the form of a cavalry patrol from Fort Davis. The soldiers, led by a young lieutenant named Collins, quickly sized up the situation and positioned themselves between the fleeing group and their pursuers. "This is U.S. Army business now," Lieutenant Collins informed Morrison. "These people are under our protection." Morrison protested loudly, claiming his property had been stolen. But when the lieutenant asked to see legal documentation of ownership, Morrison had nothing but a handful of gambling debts and bills of sale that wouldn't hold up under proper scrutiny. Faced with the authority of the U.S. Army and no legal standing, Morrison and his men were forced to turn back. The lieutenant escorted Daniel's group to the nearest town where they were able to rest and recover before continuing their journey. The ride back to Cedar Ridge took longer than expected as they had to travel slowly to accommodate Mary Catherine's injuries and the twins' weakened condition, but gradually the girls began to recover their spirits. Hannah, always the more talkative of the twins, chattered constantly, as if making up for months of enforced silence. Rebecca remained quieter, but Sarah May could see the light returning to her eyes day by day. Daniel proved endlessly patient with all of them, helping with cooking, standing guard at night, and never once complaining about the delays or the additional expense of feeding and caring for 4 people instead of 2. "Why are you doing this?" Rebecca asked him one evening as they sat around their campfire. "We're not really your family. You barely knew Sarah May when you married her." Daniel looked across the fire at Sarah May, who was tending to a cut on Mary Catherine's hand. "Family isn't just about blood," he said quietly. "It's about choice. It's about standing by people when they need you, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Your sister chose to trust me with her life, and I chose to honor that trust. That makes you my family, too." Sarah May felt her heart squeeze with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize as love. This man who had asked nothing of her but companionship and respect had risked his life and spent his savings to rescue her sisters. He had given them all a future when they had none. When they finally reached Daniel's ranch, it felt like coming home in the truest sense. The house that had seemed spacious for 2 now felt cozy with 5. But they made it work. The twins shared Sarah May's room while Mary Catherine took the spare room Daniel had been using for storage. Everyone pitched in with the daily tasks, and soon the ranch was running more smoothly than it ever had. Elizabeth's husband, the kind rancher who had purchased her at the auction, brought her for a visit a month later. The reunion of all 5 sisters was emotional and joyful, with tears and laughter in equal measure. "I can't believe you got them all out," Elizabeth said to Daniel, shaking his hand with genuine gratitude. "I don't know how we can ever thank you." "Just be happy," Daniel replied. "That's thanks enough." As autumn turned to winter, the household settled into new rhythms. Hannah discovered she had a talent for working with the horses, while Rebecca proved gifted at sewing and mending. Mary Catherine, her physical wounds healed, took over much of the cooking and became the unofficial mother hen of the group. The girls brought laughter and conversation to the ranch, filling the rooms with the kind of life Catherine O'Brien had once dreamed of. But it was the quiet moments between Daniel and Sarah May that held the most significance. They had grown comfortable with each other in ways that went beyond mere politeness. Sarah May found herself watching for Daniel's return each evening. And Daniel began lingering over their conversations on the porch, reluctant to see each day end. One evening in late December, as they sat watching the first snowfall of the season, Sarah May finally found the courage to voice what had been growing in her heart for months. "Daniel," she said softly. He turned to her, his gray eyes attentive in the lamplight. "What is it, Sarah May?"
I've grown to care for you, more than I expected to, more than just gratitude or friendship. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. I know our marriage started as a business arrangement, a way to save my life and give you companionship, but somewhere along the way, it became something more for me. At least, it did for me. Daniel was quiet for so long that Sarah May began to fear she had overstepped, had assumed feelings that weren't returned. But then he reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. Sarah May, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I started caring for you the day I saw you on those courthouse steps. So brave and defiant in the face of everything that was happening to you. Every day since then, that caring has grown deeper. I didn't want to pressure you. Didn't want you to feel obligated to return feelings you might not have. Sarah May turned on the porch swing to face him fully. And now? Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Now, I'd like very much to kiss my wife if she's amenable to the idea. She was more than amenable. When their lips met, it was with the sweetness of new love built on a foundation of respect and genuine affection. It was a kiss that sealed not just their physical union, but their emotional one as well. The wedding ring Daniel had placed on her finger during their hasty courthouse ceremony had been a simple band of gold, practical and unadorned. But that evening, he presented her with something different, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother with a small emerald surrounded by tiny diamonds. I want you to have this, he said, slipping it onto her finger beside the wedding band. Not because you're replacing Catherine in my heart, but because you found your own place there, a place that's entirely yours. Sarah May looked down at the ring, then up at the man who had become her husband in truth as well as name. I love you, Daniel O'Brien, she said, the words coming easily now that she'd found the courage to speak them. And I love you, Sarah May O'Brien, he replied, pulling her close. More than I ever thought I'd be able to love anyone again. Spring brought new beginnings to the O'Brien Ranch. Mary Catherine announced her engagement to Dr. Marcus Webb, the young physician who had been treating her injuries and had fallen in love with her gentle spirit. Hannah and Rebecca, now fully recovered from their ordeal, were courted by two brothers who owned a spread in the next county over, good men who treated them with respect and kindness. But the most significant change came in late spring when Sarah May confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was expecting Daniel's child. The news brought joy tinged with apprehension as both Sarah May and Daniel remembered the tragedy of his first son's death. But Dr. Webb assured them that Sarah May was healthy and strong and that every precaution would be taken to ensure a safe delivery. This baby will be born into love, Sarah May said one evening as she and Daniel sat on their porch, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Into a family that chose each other and fought for each other. Daniel placed his hand over hers, marveling at the miracle of new life growing beneath their joined fingers. Catherine would have loved this, he said softly. She would have loved seeing this house full of family and happiness. Tell me about her again, Sarah said, as she often did. She had never been jealous of Daniel's first wife, understanding that the human heart has room for many kinds of love, and that honoring the past didn't diminish the present. Daniel smiled, his eyes distant with memory. She used to say that love wasn't like a pie where giving someone a piece meant there was less for everyone else. She said love was like a flame. The more you shared it, the brighter it grew. As summer approached, the ranch prepared for a season of weddings and new beginnings. Mary Catherine's wedding to Dr. Webb was held in the garden behind the house with Reverend Miller officiating and the entire community of Cedar Ridge in attendance. Hannah and Rebecca's double wedding to the Morrison brothers, no relation to the unpleasant Jake Morrison who had bid on Sarah May, followed a month later. Sarah May, now obviously pregnant, stood as matron of honor for all her sisters, her happiness evident to everyone who saw her. The scared, defiant girl who had stood on the courthouse steps barely a year ago had become a confident, radiant woman surrounded by love and family. Elizabeth and her husband moved their ranch closer to Cedar Ridge so the sisters could remain near each other. And soon the O'Brien Ranch became the center of a network of family and friends that stretched across the county. In late October, as the leaves were turning gold and the air carried the crisp promise of winter, Sarah May went into labor. Delivery was long and difficult, but with Dr. Webb attending and Daniel never leaving her side, she brought forth a healthy son with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined chin.
They named him James Patrick O'Brien, honoring the memory of Daniel's first son while celebrating the promise of their future. As Daniel held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face, Sarah May saw the final healing of wounds that had seemed too deep to mend. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." Sarah May, exhausted but radiant, reached up to touch her husband's face. "We're all perfect," she said. "All of us together." And indeed, as she looked around the room filled with her sisters and their families, at the man who had saved her life and won her heart, at the baby who represented their future, Sarah May knew she was right. They were perfect, not without flaws or struggles, but perfect in their love for each other and their commitment to the family they had chosen and fought to create. The story that had begun with 5 sisters sold at auction like cattle had become something far different. A tale of love conquering circumstances, of family built on choice rather than just blood, of healing and hope, and the courage to believe in tomorrow. Years later, when young James Patrick O'Brien asked his mother to tell him the story of how she and his father met, Sarah May would smile and begin. "Once upon a time, in a dusty town called Cedar Ridge, something wonderful happened, disguised as something terrible. And that, my darling boy, is how our family began." The ranch continued to prosper, growing with each passing season. More children came, daughters with Sarah May's green eyes and sons with Daniel's steady disposition. The house was expanded to accommodate the growing family, but it never lost its feeling of warmth and welcome. Sarah never forgot the lessons learned during that terrible day at the courthouse, that dignity must be fought for, that family is chosen as much as born, and that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest tomorrows. She and Daniel raised their children with these truths, ensuring that the next generation would understand both the value of freedom and the responsibility that comes with it. And if sometimes on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful under the vast Texas sky, Sarah May would look at her husband and remember the man who had offered his name instead of his ownership. She was reminded once again of the power of a single moment to change everything. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge still stood, but it would never again witness such a shameful spectacle. Laws changed, people learned, and the community that had once stood by and watched injustice became one that actively fought against it. The O'Brien family, in their quiet way, had helped change not just their own story, but the story of their entire town. As for the McKinnon sisters, they all found their own versions of happiness. Elizabeth became a prominent rancher and advocate for women's rights. Mary Catherine established a small hospital with her physician husband. Hannah bred some of the finest horses in Texas, while Rebecca opened a dress shop that served customers from 3 counties. And Sarah May became the heart of it all, the sister who had not only survived being sold at auction, but had transformed that terrible experience into the foundation of something beautiful and lasting. The last daughter left behind had indeed been saved, not by a grieving widower's offer of his name, but by her own courage to accept a hand extended in friendship and grow it into love. And in saving herself, she had saved them all. Real Story Diary.